Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Olivia Fahey, and I'm the product marketing lead here at Akoya, and I'll be hosting the session today. This is the first of 3 webinars in our Open Banking Compliance series hosted by Akoya and Capgemini. The goal of this series is really to prepare financial institutions of all sizes as we move toward open banking regulatory requirements this fall. We've partnered with experts at Capgemini to really go beyond the baseline. We're not here to discuss the impending regulation or its implications. If you're here, we assume you're already well versed in those. Think of these webinars more as practical guides to becoming 1033 compliant. We're really going to dig into what it takes to stand up the technology, the policies, procedures, and especially the third-party risk management to both meet and maintain compliance for the long haul. So throughout this next several months, via these webinars, thought leadership that we'll be putting out, and some really hands-on tools, what we aim to do is provide financial institutions like yours with the education and the resources to make informed decisions and help bring your organizations into compliance as seamlessly and effectively as possible. So with that, let's move into the slides. In terms of a little bit of housekeeping here, we have 45 minutes together. We're holding 10 to 15 minutes at the end of the webinar for questions. Questions can be submitted using the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. If we don't get to your question, we will plan to answer all questions and send them out as a follow-on with the email that include this recorded webinar at the end. So without further ado, let me introduce our 2 speakers today. First, we have Vijay Krishna, Chief Product Officer at Akoya. Hi, Vijay. Vijay is responsible for driving the strategic product direction here at Akoya. He has over 20 years of experience in the financial services industry, with over a decade each at Citi and MasterCard. Prior to Akoya, Vijay spent 10 years at MasterCard in multiple global and regional roles. Welcome, Vijay. And next, we're very happy to have Rishabh Shah here. Rishabh is Vice President and creator of Capgemini's Open Banking solution. He also has over 20 years of consulting experience in information technology and currently leads multiple projects related to open finance across the world in Europe, the US, the Middle East, India, Australia, and Latin America. Welcome, Rishabh. We're very happy to have you. And with that, I will hand it over to Rishabh to dive into our content today.
Thank you so much, Olivia. Thank you everyone for joining this webinar today. I will begin by introducing Capgemini. We are a global business and technology transformation partner for some of the largest enterprises globally. We are a team of 340,000 consultants, and we have a heritage of 55 years, and we cover around 50 countries across the globe. Now, what that does for us is it gives us a very global perspective, but it also enables us to have extremely local context, right? In terms of the solutions that we deliver, we bring together deep industry expertise. We combine it with our capabilities in AI, in cloud, and in data to deliver industry-leading solutions to our clients. Moving on. Now, what does that really mean from an open banking perspective? To give you a little bit of history, we started getting involved into open banking with the regulation in Europe, which is essentially PSD2. Since then, we have worked on PSD2. We have worked on the CMA order from UK. We have worked on CDR from Australia. We have worked on several regulations related to open banking and open finance in the Middle East, in Latin America. So we really get a global perspective having executed all of these different projects. And the way we deliver this global perspective is through our world report. So in the center, what you see is the World Payment Report. And this year, the topic of the World Payments Report, which is now in its 20th edition, is essentially the combination of open finance with instant payments, right? So this is something that you might want to check out. Now, I was talking about the local context, right? It is not just about the global perspectives, it is also about the local context. So on the right-hand side, what you see is essentially our Open Finance Maturity Index from Brazil. So as we work in a specific geography, we develop that deep context of that particular geography. And then we kind of bring out reports that are very, very specific, and reports and thought leadership, I would say, that is very specific to that particular geography. Now, on your extreme left-hand side, what you really see is the type of projects that we execute, right? And one of the projects that we speak about in this particular slide is the project that we did with HMRC, which is the tax department of the UK, and how we enabled that particular tax department to actually use the pay by bank, which is essentially the PISP functionality of open banking, to start to enable the UK citizens to start paying taxes using payment initiation, right? And this is something that has actually gotten mentioned in the impact report of open banking in the UK. Moving on. Now, as you really look at the 1033 order and also our learnings from the different regulations that we have worked across the globe, we can break the capability map into 4 different sections. The first section I would that I would call out is the operations, and this is related to everything related to the third parties. So, say for example, the onboarding of the third parties, the due diligence that you really need, the ongoing support of the third parties, the entire life cycle of the third parties is essentially covered in this particular section. The next section is essentially the privacy and security, right? So open banking actually deals with a very interesting phenomena, right? You have to balance the open with the customer privacy, and that balance is extremely difficult to attain, right? And this has been an evolutionary journey throughout the globe wherever we have gotten involved with open banking, and that is the topic that is essentially covered as a part of the privacy and security section of everything that has to be implemented. The third part is essentially the experiences, and I would really call the third party developer experiences, because they are the ones who would finally create all the value added services for the end customer. So everything related to the developer portal, the sandbox, the test data, policies, procedures, all of that combined together is an experience that has to be delivered to the third party developers, right, and engineers. And the final part is the open APIs, which is all about APIs, the standards, the regulatory and performance monitoring, the whole gamut of things. Now, the very interesting thing that I would like to point out here is the fact that every time we talk about open banking, it is generally considered to be APIs, right? But through this particular capability map, the important message that we want to give you is that 1033 or any such similar regulation globally has taught us that there's a lot more to open banking compliance than just the APIs. Right? That's a very important learning that we have had in the past. And since I'm talking about learnings, I think we can move on to some of the key learnings that we have had in the long journey of open banking that we have seen globally. The first one that I want to talk about is the fact that this is not a sprint. This is actually a marathon. And I would like to highlight that through the experience of, say, one of the geographies that we have worked in, which is Europe. So open banking technically in Europe started with the PSD2 regulation, which is now morphing into the PSD3 regulation. It is actually getting expanded with the FIDA regulation, right? It is getting coupled with what is called as the PSR. So already we have seen a 7 or an 8 year journey around PSD2, and the journey is expanding with PSD3 and further regulations coming in this particular space. And the key message here is that you really need to be prepared to run a marathon, which essentially means that there are sustained investments that are needed over an extended period of time. Moving on. Now, this slide actually talks about the trust framework, right? And again, I would go back to the original comment that I made, which is essentially that open banking is all about balancing the open with the customer privacy, right? But then there are additional dimensions that start getting added on. When you really start talking about customer privacy, you also have to think about things like fraud. You have to start thinking about customer friction that might get introduced because of all the trust and security frameworks that you're implementing, right? So everything has to be balanced, and this is a difficult balance that we have seen emerging in the geographies that we have actually worked in, and it is still evolving. See, the most important part is, are we at a point from the experiences in different geographies where we can say that the trust framework is perfect? I don't think so, right? It is still evolving, and I'll give you some examples about that. The critical part here is that most of the institutions, financial institutions, underestimate the amount of work that really needs to be done in order to implement a proper trust framework. Now, moving on. So I was talking about the fact that the trust framework is evolving, right? So let me give you a few examples of it. In Europe, with PSD3, the liability model between the TPPs and the financial institutions is undergoing a change, right? Which is one example of how the framework itself is evolving. The banks in Europe and actually the regulator in Europe is looking at the possibility of allowing banks to share data between themselves from a fraud prevention perspective, right? So how will that be done is still to emerge fully, but that's also an example of how some of the security protocols and trust frameworks are evolving, right? There's emergence of digital identity wallets, right? And these wallets will again have an intersection with open banking and open finance evolution, and which will also again lead to enhancements in the trust framework itself, right? So there's a lot of activity that is going on, which again goes back to the point that this requires sustained investments over a long period of time. Moving on. Okay, so this is an important one. This talks about the integration costs. And having worked with so many different financial institutions globally, what we have come to realize is the fact that the data, finally the customer's data or the data owner's data, is in systems of record within financial institutions, which are essentially legacy systems. These legacy systems and this data has service interfaces which are bespoke. And if you really look at most of the open banking standards, these standards expose data in a canonical form, right? So extracting that information out of the legacy systems needs a lot of integration effort, orchestration effort. And in a lot of cases, it actually needs some amount of redesign because the data and the state of that particular data that has to be described to the third parties is different than how that data exists within the system of records. We have actually seen that integration costs sometimes can go as high as 40–50% of the total cost of implementing an open finance, open banking type of a project, right? So this is pretty significant from a cost perspective. Moving on. Now, let's talk a little bit about the third-party support, right? From a third-party support perspective, now imagine that you are a financial institution and you suddenly have to support 500 or 600 different third parties, right? And we have seen situations in the past where a lot of the third parties will be able to access the information, but a few of the third parties are facing some of the challenges or other, right? And when you have very large number of third parties, these type of issues will need a support model that really needs to scale out and really needs to scale out really rapidly. Now that's fundamental in one aspect in terms of the fact that supporting a third party is very different than supporting the captive channels that financial institutions have today, right? So it requires a different mindset, it requires a different approach. But and if we can go to the next slide as well. But it also has a dimension where the regulators start demanding a specific level of operational guidance, right? That is given by the regulators in terms of the version management, in terms of deprecation of the APIs, in terms of availability, in terms of performance, etc., right? So all of these aspects, all of these different dimensions have to be combined together as you start thinking about a support model that has to be provided to the third parties. And if the number of third parties connecting into your institution is large, then the support model actually becomes quite significant in terms of how it needs to be scaled and how it really needs to be structured, right, from a cost perspective. So these are some of the key learnings that we have had from the different geographies, working with many financial institutions, working with a lot of the ecosystem players within the open banking, open finance gamut, right, across the geographies. With that, I will like to hand over to my co-panelist, Vijay, to talk through the Akoya solution. Over to you, Vijay.
Thanks, Rishabh. Capgemini is an incredible technology partner to us, and they're also thought partners. As you can see, what Rishabh brings to the table is a significant amount of global experience. And the US being slightly, late in this entire journey, it's super important for us to actually pick up some of those cues from the rest of the world. So before I get into the solution itself, I do want to kind of provide some context on who we are. And I think it's important because it will add some credibility to the solution that we're going to propose to you. The first part is that Akoya is a data access network at its core, right? It allows consumers to share their financial data that resides with their banks and financial institutions in a safe and secure manner with third parties that want that data to provide them different services, right? So that is what we are at a core. We were founded in 2020, so a pretty late entrant into the game in the US, but with three core principles. And those core principles we hold very dearly to whatever we do, right? The first is the fact that consumer privacy and protection is absolutely fundamental to whatever we do, and it is non-negotiable. The second, which I think kind of goes hand in hand, is that all of the data that we provide through our network is through APIs. What that means is that we do not ask consumers for their login credentials. We do not store those login credentials. And as a consequence, we have no use for the login credentials. In a very crude form, we don't screen scrape. And the third, the most important piece, is that we are a pass-through network, which means that we don't hold the data, we don't store the data, and we have no support for any secondary use of the data, right? So those are the three core principles that we were founded on. We've stuck to those core principles because that is our differentiation in the market. And it also, kind of goes hand in hand with the technology stack that we've created, which is highly scalable and super flexible. And you will realize why this is important as we go through this presentation. Right. So as I mentioned, the core principles that we have aligned with a lot of players in the ecosystem. As a consequence, in a very short period of time, Akoya has become pretty much the most inclusive network in the US. And I'll tell you what that means. It means that on our network, we have financial institutions of all sizes, large, medium, small, credit unions, core processors, we have fintechs, and we have all the major aggregators connected to Akoya to either deliver data or receive data from us. But there is also another, aspect to the core principles. It also resonated with a lot of our financial institution partners, who then appointed Akoya as their service provider for third parties to access their data, or their customers, permission data, as I would call it. And in that role as a service provider for financial institutions, we've processed billions of transactions on behalf of fairly prominent financial institutions like Fidelity and BNC, and many, many more. Right. So as you can kind of see, the path that we've taken from being a network to a service provider for the banks has allowed us to create that tech stack that is required, not just for the scalability that is required to support these institutions, but also the fact that we have this entire white labeled consumer journey that is going to be absolutely important for you to deliver to your consumers, right, as part of the 1033 solution. And then when you combine this with our, our third-party risk management and the entire process that we do in terms of managing our third parties, you can understand that this is an entire comprehensive end-to-end solution, one of the probably unique solutions in the market that can pretty much take the entire load off the financial institution and absorb it on your behalf. Right. So before we get into the actual solution itself, let's launch a poll. And I think let's make this interactive. We'd love to hear from you. What do you anticipate will be your organization's biggest challenge as it relates to becoming compliant with Section 1033? So we'll give it a couple, 10 or 15 seconds. I'd love to see you guys respond to that. Okay. I think we can close the poll. And we have the results. Okay, managing third-party security reviews, I think, is the hands down winner. And of course, this wasn't multiple choice. You had to choose one. So I guess in order of, order of importance, it's third-party risk management is pretty much one of the bigger aspects that people are thinking about, which is great. So it doesn't matter what you answered out here. We have something for you in the next slide as we go along. So yeah, what is Akoya's 1033 compliance solution? And I think Rishabh alluded to it in his first conversation with us when he was talking to us about his experience. He actually said this, which has resonated with me, in the fact that open banking compliance anywhere in the world is much more than just standing up APIs or standardized APIs. And we understand that. And I think if you're on this call, you probably understand that too, right? And based on the previous question that you answered. So what we want to talk about is the Akoya solution that actually is kind of taking the entire, end-to-end aspect of your 1033 compliance journey. Fundamental to that, and think of this as layers of the cake, essentially the fundamental to that is a developer portal, which is white labeled and branded as per your financial institution, right? Now, that portal has a few aspects that are important. The first thing is your policies, which you're supposed to make, available publicly for on what your institution believes is your data policy. The second would be your API documentation, which would be again white labeled. And then there would be the sandbox and everything else. In the developer portal, you will also have FTX compliant APIs. So whatever form your data is in, Akoya will pull that data and make it compliant to the latest spec of FTX, obviously assuming that FTX is going to be the standard setting organization in this space, right? The third part of this is the entire consent management space. From authentication, authorization to consent management. There is an entire workflow that needs to be created with the highest security standards, right? And that is what we will do while providing you the assets that are required for your consumers to have visibility into the applications that they have subscribed to and to be able to revoke or manage that consent as they wish, right? So you can actually take those assets and make them available in your digital properties. So these three, to my mind, the dev portal, the FDX APIs, and the end-to-end consent management, to my mind, are the tech stack. Now we have the managed services stack, which kind of starts at the point where you have this developer portal available, and then there are third parties who are knocking on your door wanting to access your customers' data. And that is where the first part of that is onboarding them, and before that, you have to do a third-party due diligence on them. This could potentially be your biggest overhead, right? And we understand that. There are reports in Europe that up to 20% of the fintechs in the market actually went directly to banks to get this data. So imagine that in the US context. There could be hundreds. So what Akoya can do for you is that we can take our robust solution that we have created for ourselves that has been informed by some of the biggest banks in the country. We can layer your risk profile on top of that, or your risk framework on top of that, and do this entire process on your behalf. Still giving you the control so that you have the final ability to say yes or no, but we could do all the hard work before that. Adding on top of that, we would then it's not a one and done. We would onboard these third parties. And more importantly, we would also provide them level one and level 2 support as they become, effective on your platform. So this is what we say is the end-to-end solution from Akoya, right? From all the way from the tech stack to the managed services and everything in between. We become your partners and we can take on all of these roles. Obviously, this is a very high version of this. There is a lot more detail to this as we kind of talk about it in the future. Okay, why Akoya? And I think this is important, right? I think let's start with the fact that I mentioned we do a lot of this today for some of the most prominent financial institutions in the market. We do this at scale, and we've been doing this for a couple of years. So we have some sort of a proven track record here. I talked about the modular and flexible tech stack. That is absolutely critical. As you scale, your business scales, we need to be able to scale with you so that you get the best performance, because you also have a regulatory requirement in terms of performance. But the modular and flexible tech stack also plays itself in some other ways, which is what we've discovered as we've been talking to financial institutions. We've realized in the US, no financial institution is pretty much the same as the other. So there could be various aspects of your business that we need to take into account while we help you on your journey. So for instance, you could have multiple platforms that you get your data from. You could have affiliates that some of those could have come through acquisitions, for instance. Or you could be supporting a slew of co-brands where the consumer's affinity is with the co-brand and not with you as a financial institution. We need to be able to take all of those and make a 1033 solution that is viable for you. And that is what our flexible tech stack allows us to do. The third aspect is the risk management piece that I talked about, which is the third-party risk management informed by the biggest banks, as well as other guidance from regulators. And the context-based part comes in when we work with your risk framework, apply that to our risk model, and we make it appropriate for the third parties that are coming to you. So in a very simple term, a financial institution coming to you for data versus a fintech versus an aggregator could go through different levels of due diligence based on the risk that you would ascribe to them, right? And we would administer that on your behalf. And similarly, we would also be able to help you with administering your legal contracts, right? So with the third parties managing the life cycle of those legal contracts and making sure they're renewed and everything else. And finally, as Rishabh mentioned, this is not a one and done game, right? The fact is there are many aspects that the banks are still catching up on, while regulation, for instance, in Europe is moving forward. There could be new regulation. There could be more data sets that need to be made available. There could be more use cases that could come in. There could be more security requirements that could come in, right? And of course, the standard setting organization even now has 2 releases in a year in terms of new things that they want you to do. What Akoya solution will allow you is that this is something that we will do on your behalf on an ongoing basis. So we not just make you compliant, we keep you compliant. Go to the next slide. Okay. Can we do a quick poll again, just to get a sense of where everyone is on their 1033 journey? Again, 15, 20 seconds. Slightly more dense copy here, so I'll give it a couple of extra seconds. Okay. Do you think we can look at the results? Okay, discovery phase, business planning phase, technical phase. And Maureen, can you scroll down? And yeah, okay, we're ready to implement, which is absolutely fine, which completely makes sense in terms of where you should be. And again, if you work with us, we can take what you have and move forward with you and work towards your compliance deadline and make sure you're there well before time. Right. Now, I just kind of end this section with the fact that Akoya has the experience and the expertise. By experience, I mean that most of our leadership team today has over 2 decades of experience in the financial services industry. A lot of us have built products and solutions that needed to be compliant by regulation. So we know what it takes, right? So that experience is available to you. We also have the expertise, right? We have a lot of deep open banking expertise in the form of, just the people who've been with this industry for a very long time, including one of the co-founders of FTX, who is our chief evangelist. How do I know that? Because he doesn't stop talking about it. So as a consequence, we have the experience and the expertise to bring to bear to your doorstep a true partner who can help you on this 1033 journey and make you successful. That is important for you from a regulatory perspective. Right. Now, as we kind of look at this journey, I think Olivia mentioned this, we are going to have a lot of tools available on our website so that you can kind of, work with us. Some of them are already available. Today, we've launched this compliance checklist, as we call it. This is a comprehensive checklist of all the elements that need to go into 1033 compliance, mapping it back to the map that Rishabh had shown right up front, the compliance map, as each called it. And this is really staged in terms of what the elements are and how much time we believe each of those elements is going to take. Right. So feel free to download this. You can use the QR code on the screen right now to to download this checklist. Use this as your ready reckoner, as we call it. But I think what we would like is that if you want to kind of set up some time, a 30-minute session with one of our team members, we'd love to kind of look at this checklist if you already have it completed and work from there to say what you would need to kind of be compliant. Okay. I'm going to hand this back to Olivia at this stage. Thank you.
Thanks, Vijay. So before we get into the Q&A, I just have one more shameless plug. So hopefully you've enjoyed the content today and want to stay with us as we continue our open banking compliance series. Our next webinar will take place on November 5th. We'll be joined by Ramandeep Singh from Capgemini and Baram Penthaki of Akoya. That session will really take a very consumer-centric lens and discuss how 1033 will have real benefits, not only for your business, but also for your customers. So you can either scan that QR code there or use the link on top there, but that'll just bring you to a registration page, and hopefully we'll see you then on November 5th as well. So with that, how much time? We have about 10 to 12 minutes to jump into the Q&A here. So I will take one of these pre-submitted ones, and then I will send it over to you, Vijay, to read through what we've gotten during the session. So someone asked, my bank is in the third tranche of 1033 compliance. So compliance for me seems to be about 30 months post rulemaking. When should I start planning for compliance, in your opinion? Vijay, if you want to take that, and then Rishabh, please feel free to add on.
Sure. Let me answer it by kind of turning this question on its head a little bit. Fundamentally, let's think about what open banking is allowing, right? It's allowing your consumers to avail of products and services in a safe and secure manner. The way we deliver that in a safe and secure manner is through APIs and through all of the OAuth processes that are involved in that. Now, in the absence of having APIs, you are getting screen scraped, which essentially means that your consumers are giving their login credentials to somebody else who's a third party, putting them as well as you as a financial institution at risk. And I totally understand the fact that till now, the struggle has been how you create a business case to make these APIs available, because as we've discussed throughout the session, it is all about the effort and the time it's going to take to be compliant. But if now the entire question is about when and not about if, then I would strongly recommend that you have this conversation within your organization to say, why should we not do it now, right? Or at least start on the journey now in terms of discovery to try and get this done quickly, just so that you provide the right experience for your consumers and their data, as well as your bank or your financial institution is safe and secure, right? So I would say now is a perfect time. It is a little bit of a self-serving answer, but I'm not saying you need to start building now. You need to start planning now. You need to start the discovery process now, and then you can start thinking about when you want to implement, right? I don't know, Rishabh, if you have anything else to add to this.
No, I would just agree vehemently with you, Vijay, primarily because what we have seen in other geographies is that it's always a rush towards the end when you're up against a regulatory deadline, right? And in case that your financial institution has 30 months or a significant amount of time before you really hit that particular regulatory timeline, it gives you time to really plan and do this entire journey very effectively with the right foundations, right? So I would say make use of this particular time.
Perfect. So I have one more question, which I think I'll direct to you, Rishabh. And it is, by which year do you think PSD3 would be adopted by tier one banks? It's a loaded question, but
Yeah, I mean, I think today we are talking about 1033. So PSD3 and PSR and FIDA are really topics from a Europe perspective. I would say the regulatory timelines will be around 2026, right? When a lot of these things will have to be implemented. But again, coming back to the topic of this conversation, which is 1033 and US, I would say the regulators tend to influence each other. That is what we have seen, right? So a lot of those experiences from PSR, PSD3, as well as FIDA is likely to also cross across the Atlantic Ocean. I mean, and have some impact in the US as well. But that's a hypothesis, right? You never know what is actually going to happen.
that's fair. Risham, I'm sorry, I'm going to put you on the spot again. There is one more question. Can you provide some insight into the profile of the data recipients that are coming in directly to the financial institutions in Europe? Is there a certain profile? Is it kind of more widespread? What's the general,
Yeah,
access?
I would actually say that the bigger the open banking ecosystem is, right? The more complex it becomes, the more complex the integration problems between the participant actually becomes. So let me try and explain what I really mean by this. If there are 10 third parties and 10 banks, right, it's a manageable problem from an integration perspective. But the moment you have 1,000 third parties and 1,000 financial institutions, right, that those third parties actually have to reach, it becomes an extremely difficult integration problem to solve, right? And then the business question actually in front of the data recipients is, do I really want to solve for the integration problem, or should I focus on the value added services that actually have to be delivered to the end consumer, right? And that is essentially the realization that I see starting to happen in a lot of the geographies. And I think that is assisted by the fact that not only have a lot of the data aggregators solved for the integration problem or solved to quite a large extent the integration problem, but they have also started offering a lot of value-added services in terms of the classification of transactions, et cetera, right? Which essentially help in the implementation of the use cases to the data recipients. So I would say I see a lot of the institutions actually starting to depend upon the data aggregators for the connectivity related things, and also some of the foundational data classification, data tagging type of use cases, right? While the data recipients actually start building on in terms of what are the value added services, or what are the actual customer proposition that they really want to take to their end consumers. That's how I see it evolving.
And again, just to kind of say that every market's going to be different. The US market is very different than the Europe market. So I guess this is something that, will play out as we see this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
I mean, the number of banks and the number of fintechs is obviously multiples of what we have in Europe. So it's going to be interesting to look at. Olivia, this is a question for you. Will the presentation be shared with participants? And what other assets are we going to share?
Yes, afterwards, we will share a recording of the webinar out, any unanswered questions, and a PDF version of this presentation, along with, again, pointing people to that financial institution readiness worksheet that is available on our Akoya.com website as well.
Perfect. Cool. I think we have time for one or two more, and I see a few more. Does Akoya's compliance solution comply with multiple API standards? For example, could it be implemented for a multinational institution that has to comply with both 1033 directive and Brazil's open banking scheme? The honest answer is we don't know. I think it'll require a deep dive where we sit together and we try and look at the schemas and we try and compare the schemas to see where the disconnects are. Fundamentally, if you're looking at the primary use cases for open banking, the data sets and the data clusters should align. Now, the fact is, can you kind of use the same framework for another market? I don't know, Rishabh, is that something that the regulators are looking at as they kind of, what have you seen? How similar are the schemas as you've seen them get deployed across the globe?
So, see, look, most of the schemas have evolved from the ISO standards, right? The ISO messaging standards, because that was what was available when there was nothing else in terms of the open banking standards, right? And I'm talking way back in 2016, 2017. So the schemas are certainly similar, right? But every geography has regionalized the schemas to suit the specific local context, right? So, for example, if you really look at a lot of the schemas in Brazil, you will find certain very specific information that you might not really see in the UK standard, for example, right? So there are differences between these standards as they have evolved in different geographies. And the way we generally approach it is that when you're moving from one country to another, there is certainly a regionalization and a customization that has to be done, even if you have the core platform and core solution available, right? So the core will probably take you 60-70% of the way, but then there is certainly a customization that has to be done for every geography that you want to implement the solution in.
Perfect. Okay, I think I'll just try and squeeze in one last one. So the question is, what's the biggest opportunity for community banks and credit unions? I can take that quickly. I feel fundamentally it's about the consumer. Those consumers are going outside the financial institution to avail of some services, and they're going to do that, and that's happening today. So the question is, how do you make sure that you are part of that entire journey, right? How do you make sure that the consumer does not feel like they're getting compromised? They have to, they are kind of having to provide their credentials to a third party for them to provide access to their bank. So I think if you look at it from that lens, I feel like the community banks and credit unions have a unique position where the journey requires the consumer to go to the bank, authenticate. Now, if the bank provides incremental controls, like one of my financial institutions every 3 to 6 months sends me a message to say, listen, these are all the players that you're providing your data to. Do you want to continue? Do you want to discontinue? Suddenly you start coming across as somebody who cares, who's it's not about the fact that the data is going out from them, but you as a consumer are important to them, right? I think there are various aspects to this, I would say, in terms of how credit unions and community banks can actually take advantage of this. But fundamentally, it's about consumer engagement and being in the middle of that entire, right? So I think we've kind of run out of time. There are a couple of more questions. We will try and take them and send out responses across everything. But from my perspective, thank you so much, everyone. And Rishabh, thank you again. You're always a great partner, Olivia. And we shall see you hopefully on November 5th for our second in the series of this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.